They gave her the abandoned kitchen. It was meant as an insult, a gilded cage of cold stone and creeping ivy, a place to put the inconvenient poor relation where she would not be seen. Mrs. Arabella Crane, with a smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass, had called it a kindness. "A little domain of your own, Prudence," she had said, her voice dripping with a condescension that was its own form of cruelty. "So you might feel you are contributing." Prudence Lockhart had accepted with a quiet nod. She did not point out that she had been contributing for 5 years, ever since her parents' deaths had left her penniless and at the mercy of her distant cousin, the late Mrs. Severn of Withercombe. For 5 years, her contributions had been invisible, mending linens no one else would touch, balancing household accounts the steward found too tedious, sitting with the sickly child of a tenant while the doctor was summoned. She was a ghost in the architecture of the great house, a necessary cog that was never acknowledged. Now she had been banished to the north wing, to the old still room and preserve kitchen that had not been used in a generation. It was a place of ghosts, too. The air was thick with the dust of forgotten years and the faint, spectral scent of rosemary and dried lavender. Stone flagstones, slick with a fine green damp, drank the warmth from her thin-soled shoes. But as Prudence stood in the center of the cavernous room, her gaze traveled over the slate shelves, the cavernous hearth black with ancient soot, the copper pots dulled to a murky brown. They did not know it was an armory. They had given her a kingdom. Her first days were a campaign of reclamation. She wore a plain apron over her plain gray dress, and she worked. She swept away decades of cobwebs, her broom whispering against the stone. She scrubbed the slate shelves until they were dark and clean, their surfaces cool and ready. She hauled buckets of water from the courtyard pump, her arms aching, and washed the flagstones until the damp chill began to recede. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ingram, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in a state of disapproval, watched her from the doorway once or twice, saying nothing before turning away with a sniff. Prudence paid her no mind. She was not working for approval. She was working for the work itself. In a locked cabinet, she found the old household recipe books, their leather covers cracked and their pages foxed with age. The ink was faded, the script a delicate, spidery hand from a woman long dead. Here were instructions for spiced plum preserves, for pickled walnuts, for rosewater cordial and candied angelica. Here were remedies for coughs and instructions for soap making. It was a library of survival, a testament to a time when a great house had to be a fortress against winter, not merely a stage for social theater. Prudence read them not as recipes, but as maps. The kitchen garden, connected to her new domain by a heavy oak door, was a ruin. Nettles choked what had once been neat beds of herbs. A hardy, ancient rosebush, its flowers a deep, defiant crimson, had thrown its thorny arms across a collapsed cold frame. But beneath the chaos, there was life. A patch of stubborn mint, the feathery tops of feral carrots. A gnarled apple tree, its fruit small and bitter, but sound. Prudence tied her hair back, found a rusted trowel, and began to clear the earth. She worked until her back ached and her hands were raw, but a small, neat square of dark soil emerged from the wilderness. It was a start. It was hers. Mr. Gideon Severn, the master of Withercombe, was as neglected as the north wing. A year had passed since his wife, the daughter of Mrs. Crane, had died, and grief had hollowed him out, leaving a man of cold silences and abrupt movements. He walked the halls of his own home like a trespasser, his face a mask of stern control.
He ate what was put before him without tasting it,
signed the papers the steward presented without reading them, and endured Mrs. Crane's suffocating management of his household because he lacked the energy to resist. The house was dying around him, a slow, quiet decay of morale and purpose, and he was dying with it. One evening, fleeing the drawing room where Mrs. Crane was entertaining neighbors with a maudlin retelling of her daughter's virtues, Gideon found himself wandering the unfamiliar corridors of the north wing. He was drawn not by a thought, but by a scent, faint and surprising. Not the cloying perfume his mother-in-law favored, nor the stale dust of disuse. It was the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and simmering fruit, a smell so warm and honest it felt like a memory of a life he had never lived. The corridor ended at the door to the old kitchen. A sliver of warm candlelight shone from beneath it. He pushed it open. The room was transformed. The hearth held a gentle glowing fire, and on it a copper pot bubbled slowly, releasing the fragrant steam that had drawn him there. The slate shelves were no longer empty, but were beginning to fill with rows of gleaming glass jars, each catching the firelight like a jewel. And at a heavy wooden table in the center of the room stood Prudence Lockhart. She did not notice him at first. Her head was bent, her focus absolute, as she used a small pair of tongs to place a star anise into a jar of deep purple plums. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. Her hands, he noted, were not the pale, idle hands of a gentlewoman. They were stained with fruit juice, a small cut on one knuckle, but they moved with a steady, practiced grace. A ledger lay open beside her, and with a pen she made a neat entry, her lips moving silently as she counted. She was not beautiful, not in the way his late wife had been. There was no artifice to her, no delicate fragility. Her face was pale and serious, her brown hair pulled back severely from her forehead. But in the quiet competence of her actions, in the focused order she was creating from forgotten things, there was a strength that felt more real than any drawing-room charm. He must have made a sound, a shifting of his weight on the stone floor, for she looked up, and her eyes, a clear, intelligent gray, widened in surprise. She did not blush or stammer. She simply straightened and met his gaze, a question in her expression. "Mr. Severn," she said, her voice low and calm. He felt an unfamiliar awkwardness. He was the master of the house. He needed no reason to be here. Yet he felt like an intruder in her quiet world. His eyes fell to the row of sealed jars on the table. They were labeled in her neat, precise script. Spiced Plum Preserve, Withercombe, October. "What is this?" he asked. His voice sounded rough in the quiet room. "I am making use of the last of the orchard's fruit, sir," she replied. "The winter plums. It would have been a waste to let them rot." A waste. The word snagged in his mind. He looked around the great, cold house, at the listless servants, the mounting bills, his own empty days. So much waste. And here, in this forgotten corner, this one woman was fighting it, one jar at a time. He said nothing more. He simply stepped forward, picked up one of the finished jars, still warm from the canning, and turned and left the room. He did not see the look of quiet confusion on Prudence's face as she watched him go. Back in the suffocating silence of his study, Gideon Severn sat and stared at the jar. It was a simple, humble thing, but it was also perfect. The plums were whole, suspended in a clear, dark syrup. The label was straight, the seal secure. It was a product of care and intention. He found a spoon and broke the wax seal. The aroma that rose to meet him was sharp and sweet and warm. He took a spoonful. The flavor exploded in his mouth. It was not just sweet, it was complex, with the warmth of cinnamon, the faint licorice bite of anise, and the deep, tart honesty of the fruit itself. It was real. It was alive. And in that moment, Gideon Severn realized it was the first thing he had truly tasted in a year. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt not the crushing weight of grief, but the faintest glimmer of something else. It was not hope. It was something harder and more practical. It was an idea. The next morning, he summoned Prudence to his study. It was a room she had never entered, a place of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of old paper and his cold cigar. He stood by the window, his back to her, a tall, imposing silhouette against the gray autumn light. "Miss Lockhart," he began, without turning, "the estate is in trouble." It was a stark, unadorned admission. Prudence waited, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She had expected a reprimand, perhaps, for being in the north wing, for using supplies. She had not expected this. He turned to face her. His eyes were dark and searching, and for the first time she saw not just grief in them, but a sharp, assessing intelligence. "The steward is a fool. My mother-in-law is concerned with appearances. No one is minding the stores. Winter is 6 weeks away, and I have 50 souls on this estate who depend on me to see them through it. Tell me, how many jars of preserve have you made?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it almost startled her. But her mind, trained to facts and figures, answered instantly. 52, sir. 30 of spiced plum, 12 of apple butter, and 10 of pickled marrow. There is enough sugar left for another 20 jars, perhaps 25 if I am frugal. The last of the flour from the summer milling comes to 8 sacks, but one has evidence of weevils. She stopped, worried she had spoken out of turn. But Gideon Severn was staring at her, a look of profound astonishment on his face. He had spent the last week trying to get a straight answer on their flour stores from his steward, a man who answered every query with a flood of excuses and vague assurances. This woman, this quiet mouse of a relation, had given him a more accurate accounting in 30 seconds than his paid manager had in a week. He walked to his desk and gestured to a chair. "Sit." She sat, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. "I am making you a proposal, Miss Lockhart. It is a matter of business. I will pay you a salary, £10 a year, with room and board." It was a small fortune to her. "In return, you will take over the provisioning of Withercombe. All of it. The purchasing, the inventory, the preservation, the distribution of winter rations to the staff and tenants. You will have full authority over the kitchens, the cellars, and the stores. You will bypass Mrs. Crane. You will bypass the steward. You will answer only to me. You will provide me with a report here, in this room, every Saturday morning. Do you understand?" Prudence felt a dizzying surge of shock, followed by a cold wave of fear. To be given such power was to be made a target. Mrs. Crane would be incandescent with rage. The steward would see her as an enemy. But then she thought of the alternative: to remain invisible, useless, subject to the whims of others. She thought of the satisfaction of the full shelves, the order she had created from chaos, the quiet hum of purpose in her kitchen. She lifted her chin and met his gaze. There was no gratitude in her expression, only a sober understanding of the task. "I understand, Mr. Severn." "Will you do it?" "Yes," she said, plainly. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if a contract had been sealed. "Good. Your authority begins immediately. Inform the staff. I will deal with my mother-in-law." And with that, she was dismissed. Prudence Lockhart walked out of the study and back toward her north wing kitchen. No longer a poor relation, no longer a ghost. She was the provisioner of Withercombe, and she had a great deal of work to do. The transformation of Withercombe began not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet, inexorable shift in the currents of the house. Prudence's first act was to take inventory. With her ledger and a piece of charcoal, she descended into the damp, sprawling cellars, a lantern held aloft. She counted every sack of oats, every barrel of salted fish, every dusty bottle of wine. She noted the damp creeping into the flour, the mice that had chewed into the sacks of barley. Her ledger filled with neat columns of figures, a stark and damning portrait of neglect. She presented her findings to Gideon the following Saturday. She did not embellish or complain. She simply read the numbers aloud in her calm, low voice. "The west cellar has a leak, which has spoiled 2 sacks of potatoes. The steward's accounts show payment to a Mr. Dobbs for 500 pounds of bacon. I can find only 300 pounds. The rest, he claims, was distributed. There is no record of who received it." Gideon listened, his expression grim, his jaw tight. He asked sharp, pointed questions. She answered each one with a fact. When she was finished, he said only, "Continue as you see fit. Purchase what is needed. Dismiss any supplier you deem dishonest. Bring the accounts to me." And so she did. She sent away the butcher who delivered underweight carcasses and the miller whose flour was cut with chalk dust. She rode the pony cart into the village of Netherfold herself, speaking directly to the farmers. She did not haggle or charm. She inspected their goods, offered a fair price for quality, and promised prompt payment. At first, they were suspicious of this plain, serious woman from the great house, but they soon learned that her word was her bond. The best produce, the finest smoked hams, the richest milk began to find its way to Withercombe's kitchens. The main kitchen staff, long used to the chaotic orders of Mrs. Crane and the poor quality ingredients from the steward, were resentful. But Prudence did not command them. She organized them. She posted clear menus a week in advance. She ensured they had the proper tools and the best ingredients. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The sullen cook found himself able to produce dishes he was proud of. The kitchen maids, who had been fed on scraps, now received the same hearty, nutritious meals as the rest of the staff. Mrs. Ingram, the housekeeper, watched all of this with narrowed, skeptical eyes. She was a loyalist to the old regime, to the memory of the late Mrs. Severn, but she could not deny what she saw. The linens, once frayed, were now neatly mended. The staff, once prone to winter coughs, were healthier, and the smell emanating from the north wing kitchen, of baking bread, of simmering soup, of roasting meats, was the smell of a house coming back to life. One afternoon, she found Prudence struggling to move a heavy barrel of salted butter. Without a word, Mrs. Ingram took the other side, and together they rolled it into place. It was not friendship. It was a truce. The weekly meetings in Gideon's study became the still point of Prudence's week. He would stand by the fire, she would sit in the chair opposite his desk, and she would read from her ledger. They spoke of crop yields and market prices, of the cost of beeswax for candles, and the need to re-thatch a tenant's roof. But as the weeks passed, the conversations began to stray. He would ask about the old rose bush in the kitchen garden, and she would tell him it was a crimson rambler, a hardy variety that bloomed late. She would mention a tenant's child was ill, and he would make a quiet note to have the doctor, Solomon Jardine, visit them. In these quiet moments, she began to see the man behind the mask of grief. She saw the worry for his people etched in the lines around his eyes, the sharp intelligence in his questions, the deep, weary loneliness he could not quite hide. And he, in turn, began to truly see her. He saw the ink stain that was perpetually on her right index finger, the way her brow furrowed when she was calculating sums in her head, the quiet dignity that required no audience. He found himself looking forward to Saturdays, to the calm order of her presence in his chaotic world. The house was still cold, still filled with the ghosts of the past, but now there was a single, steady flame burning in its heart, and it was in the north wing kitchen. The first sign of open war came, as Prudence had known it would, from Mrs. Arabella Crane. Robbed of her authority over the household stores, she saw her position at Withercombe shrinking daily. Her pronouncements on menus were ignored. Her suggestions for expensive, frivolous purchases were quietly countermanded by Prudence's frugal efficiency. But her most profound fury was reserved for the growing, unspoken alliance between her son-in-law and the woman she considered little more than a servant. She began with whispers. At tea with the vicar's wife, she would sigh dramatically and speak of her concern for poor Gideon. "He is so lost in his grief, you see. He allows this person, this Miss Lockhart, to take advantage of his distraction. The household accounts are a mystery to us all now. One hopes she is being honest." The poison spread through the drawing rooms of the county, a slow, creeping stain on Prudence's name. Mr. Fletcher Garrick, a neighboring landowner with a polished smile and a covetous eye on Withercombe's fertile water meadows, saw an opportunity. He had been quietly trying to buy the land from Gideon for months, hoping the estate's financial troubles would force a sale. Prudence's efficiency was a direct threat to his ambitions. A thriving Withercombe was a Withercombe that would not be sold. He became Mrs. Crane's most ardent sympathizer and her closest conspirator. Their first direct attack was on the winter charity. It was an old tradition for Withercombe to distribute barrels of salted fish and sacks of flour to the poorest families in Netherfold. Prudence had taken great care with the selection, ensuring the provisions were of the highest quality. A week after the distribution, a rumor began to circulate in the village. The Withercombe flour was tainted. The fish was spoiled. Children were falling ill. Dr. Jardine, a man with a mind as sharp as his lancet, heard the rumors and marched directly up to the great house. Gideon and Prudence met him in the study. "There are 3 children in the village with stomach fevers, Seven," the doctor said bluntly. "The talk is that your charity is to blame. They say your new provisioner is buying spoiled goods to save money." Prudence felt a chill of dread, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Dr. Jardine, may I show you my ledgers, and the stores from which the charity was taken?" She led them not to the main cellars, but to her own kitchen. She showed them the remaining sacks of flour from the same milling, opening one to reveal its clean, sweet-smelling contents. She showed them the barrel of salted fish, the flesh firm and pale. Then she opened her ledger. "Here, sir, is the receipt from Miller Croft. And here," she pointed to another column, "is a list of every family that received aid, with the exact amount they were given. And here are the signatures of the 3 families whose children are now ill. As you can see, they all live downstream from Tanner's Creek,
where I know the well has been suspect for years." Dr. Jardine examined the ledger, then looked from the evidence to Prudence's earnest face. He grunted. "Sound logic, Miss Lockhart, and sound bookkeeping." He turned to Gideon. "It's the well, not your flower. I'll see to it."
But you should know, there are those who wish to see this young woman fail. The failed rumor only hardened the resolve of Mrs. Crane and Mr. Garrick. Their next move would not be a whisper campaign. It would be a direct and personal strike, aimed at the one thing Prudence could not document in a ledger: her character. The weapon they chose was a small, ornate silver box, intricately carved with a pattern of climbing roses. It had been a gift to Gideon's late wife, a box for holding expensive saffron, and it was one of the few sentimental objects Mrs. Crane kept on her dressing table, a constant, glittering reminder of her daughter's presence and her own loss. One Tuesday morning, the house was thrown into an uproar. Mrs. Crane let out a theatrical shriek from her rooms, summoning servants with a frantic ringing of her bell. The silver box was gone. She made her accusation in the grand hall, ensuring a maximum audience of servants who hovered nervously in the background. She stood before Gideon, a tragic figure in black silk, her hand pressed to her heart. Mr. Garrick stood beside her, a pillar of supportive concern. "It was her, Gideon," Mrs. Crane declared, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "It must have been Miss Lockhart. She is the only one with the run of the house now, the only one who is not one of us. She was near my rooms yesterday. I saw her myself. A common thief in my own home." Prudence had been summoned from the kitchen. She stood alone, opposite the accusers, her apron still on, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She did not speak. She simply looked at Gideon, waiting. "This is a serious accusation, Arabella," Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Search her room," Mrs. Crane insisted. "You will find it there. She would not have had time to sell it." Gideon's gaze rested on Prudence. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not suspicion, but the deep, reflexive pain of a wound being touched. The box was his late wife's. It was a piece of the grief he had tried so hard to wall away. Mrs. Crane had chosen her weapon perfectly. "Very well," Gideon said, his face a granite mask. He turned to Mrs. Ingram. "Accompany me." The procession to Prudence's small, plain room under the eaves was a walk of humiliation. Mrs. Crane followed, triumphant. Mr. Garrick, smug. Mrs. Ingram, her face unreadable. Prudence walked last, her head held high, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. Her room was sparse. A narrow bed, a small washstand, a single wooden chest for her few belongings. It took them less than a minute. Tucked beneath a neatly folded wool shawl at the bottom of the chest, Mrs. Ingram's hand closed around something hard and metallic. She drew it out. The silver rose box glittered in the dim light. Mrs. Crane let out a gasp of vindicated horror. "I knew it! A thief and a liar!" All eyes turned to Gideon. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the box in the housekeeper's hand. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Prudence felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This was it. The irrefutable evidence. Her word against a silver box. Gideon finally moved. He took the box from Mrs. Ingram, his fingers tracing the carved roses. He did not look at his mother-in-law. He did not look at Garrick. He looked only at Prudence. He walked towards her until he was standing directly in front of her, forcing her to meet his gaze. The entire household held its breath. He did not raise his voice. He spoke so softly that only she could truly hear the words. "Did you take this, Miss Lockhart?" The world narrowed to the space between them. She could see the deep conflict in his eyes, the pull of the past against the evidence of the present. She could weep, she could protest, she could throw herself on his mercy. But she had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. All she had was the truth. She lifted her chin, her gray eyes clear and unwavering. "No, Mr. Severn," she said, her voice as quiet and steady as his. "I did not." She offered no explanation, no defense, just a single, plain denial. He searched her face for another long moment. 1 second, 2, 3. He was weighing it all, the box in his hand, a relic of a dead love, against the living reality of the woman before him. He thought of the months of her tireless work, her meticulous honesty in every ledger, her quiet refusal to complain or flatter. He thought of the taste of spiced plums and the slow, steady return of life to his hollowed-out home. He saw the ink stain on her finger and the utter absence of fear or guile in her eyes. And he made a choice. He turned, the silver box still in his hand, to face the room. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and absolute. "I believe her." He took the box and placed it in his own coat pocket. "Mrs. Ingram, please escort Miss Lockhart back to the kitchen. Her work has been interrupted." He then fixed his gaze on his mother-in-law and her smirking ally. "Mrs. Crane, Mr. Garrick, a word in my study. Now." The crisis had passed, but the air at Withercombe was now charged with the tension of an undeclared war. Gideon's trust had been a shield, but Prudence knew it was not a victory. Mrs. Crane and Mr. Garrick had been publicly thwarted, and their humiliation would only curdle into a more potent venom. She retreated to the quiet order of her kitchen, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of her work, but a sense of foreboding settled over her like a winter mist. Gideon, for his part, became even more withdrawn, but his brief visits to the north wing now held a new weight. He would watch her work, a silent, brooding presence, and the unspoken trust between them was a tangible thing, a bond forged in a moment of public doubt. He began planning the annual tenants' dinner, a tradition he had abandoned in his grief. It was a feast to mark the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter, a public affirmation of the bond between the great house and the people who worked its land. Mrs. Crane saw it as an opportunity to reassert her social dominance. Garrick saw it as the perfect stage for their final, decisive attack. Prudence saw it as the greatest test of her tenure, a meal for over 100 people that had to be perfect. The great hall was decorated for the first time in years. Holly and ivy were draped from the rafters, and 2 enormous fires roared in the hearths at either end of the room, casting a warm, dancing light on the long tables. The tenants, dressed in their Sunday best, sat beside the household staff, a rare mingling of worlds. The scent of roasted meat, spiced ale, and baking bread filled the air. Prudence, having overseen every detail, remained in the background, ensuring the smooth flow of service from the kitchens, her face calm, but her senses on high alert. Gideon stood at the head of the main table, a formidable figure. He raised his glass. "To Withercombe," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "To a hard-working harvest, and to those who made it possible." A cheer went up around the room. The meal was a triumph. The tenants, used to meager fare, ate with gusto, praising the quality of the beef, the richness of the gravy, the lightness of the bread. They were the tangible proof of Prudence's success. As the plates were being cleared for dessert, Mr. Garrick rose from his seat beside a stony-faced Mrs. Crane. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and solicitous, capturing the attention of the room. "It warms my heart to see Withercombe so full of life again. And we have, it seems, Miss Lockhart to thank for this bounty." He paused, letting the faint sneer in his tone settle. "But I have recently come into possession of some troubling documents. It seems the cost of this bounty has been far greater than we knew." A murmur went through the hall. Gideon's face was unreadable, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Prudence, who stood near the doorway to the kitchens. Garrick held up a ledger page. "This, from the accounts of our esteemed miller, Mr. Croft, shows payments from Withercombe for the finest white flour. Yet I have testimony," he gestured vaguely towards the tenants, "that much of the flour delivered was of a lower grade, fit only for animals. Where, one must ask, did the difference in price go? I accuse Miss Lockhart of systematically defrauding this estate, of enriching herself by starving its people of what is rightfully theirs." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and shocking. Mrs. Crane dabbed at her eye with a handkerchief, a perfect portrait of betrayed trust. The tenants shifted uncomfortably, their loyalties torn. Prudence felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression remained serene. She took a step forward into the light. "Mr. Garrick is correct about one thing," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the hall. "There are indeed ledgers." At her signal, 2 footmen carried in a small writing desk and placed it before her. On it were her own account books. But perhaps he should have consulted all of them. She opened the first book. "This is my household ledger. Here is the entry for the payment to Miller Croft for 100 sacks of premium flour on the 17th of October. And here," she tapped a corresponding entry, "is the receipt, signed by Mr. Croft himself." She then opened a second, smaller book. This, however, is the distribution ledger. It details every single portion of flour, meat, and produce that leaves my stores. It is countersigned by the recipient. "Mrs. Gable," she said, looking towards a tenant farmer's wife. "On the 20th of October, did you receive 1 sack of premium flour for your family?" The woman, flustered at being addressed, nodded. "Yes, miss, I did. Best flour we've had in years. I signed for it." "And Mr. Perkin," she said to a grizzled old shepherd, "did your family receive yours?"
"Aye, that we did," he boomed. "And the salted bacon was a godsend."
One by one, she went through the names, and one by one, the tenants confirmed the honesty of her accounts. The foundation of Garrick's accusation began to crumble. But the final blow came from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Ingram, the formidable housekeeper, stepped forward. Her face was set like stone. "I have served this house for 30 years, she began, her voice ringing with unimpeachable authority. "I have seen good masters and bad stewards. I have seen waste, and I have seen want. What I have seen from Miss Lockhart is honesty and hard work." She then turned her steely gaze on Fletcher Garrick. "And what I saw 3 days ago was you, Mr. Garrick, in quiet conversation with Miller Croft's son, a known wastrel, passing him a purse of coins behind the village inn. I thought nothing of it, until now." The miller's son, who was serving ale at the back of the hall, turned pale and dropped a pitcher with a crash. All eyes swiveled to him, then to the thunderstruck Mr. Garrick. The conspiracy lay exposed, unraveled by a simple ledger and a housekeeper's watchful eye. Dr. Jardine, who had been observing the proceedings with a grimly satisfied expression, stood up. As the local magistrate, I believe this matter warrants a formal investigation into fraud and slander. Fletcher Garrick stood frozen for a moment, his polished facade shattered. Then, without a word, he turned and fled the great hall, a chorus of jeers and angry shouts following him into the night. Mrs. Arabella Crane sat alone at the high table, her face a mask of horrified disbelief, utterly and publicly disgraced. The tenants, seeing the truth, broke into a spontaneous, thunderous applause. But it was not for Gideon. It was for Prudence. Later that night, long after the last of the tenants had departed and a blanket of quiet had settled over the great house, Gideon found Prudence where he knew she would be. She was in the north wing kitchen, her domain, her sanctuary. The fire had been banked to a gentle glow, and the room was tidy, everything scrubbed and put back in its place. She was not working. She was simply standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit, frost-covered garden. He did not speak at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her. The moonlight softened the severe lines of her face, illuminating the quiet strength that he had come to rely on more than he had realized. She had faced down her accusers with nothing but the truth, and she had won. "They tried to break you," he said, his voice low in the stillness. "They tried to use this house's past to destroy its future." She turned from the window to face him. "They underestimated the truth, Mr. Severn. It is more resilient than they knew." "You saved this house, Prudence," he said, taking a step into the room. He used her given name for the first time, and it sounded both strange and perfectly right. "When I was lost in it, you found its heart. You saved me from it." He walked until he stood before her. He looked down at her hands. They were not the soft, useless hands of a lady of leisure. They were chapped from work, with a healing cut on one knuckle and the ever-present ink stain on her finger. They were the hands that had brought Withercombe back from the brink. He reached out and took them in his own. "I am not a man for poetry, Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I am a man who values evidence, who values truth and strength and resilience. I see it all in you." And then, to her utter astonishment, Gideon Severn, the proud, guarded master of Withercombe, went down on one knee on the cold stone floor of her kitchen. He did not release her hands. He looked up at her, his dark eyes stripped of all their defenses, leaving only a raw, profound sincerity. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said, "to be the mistress of Withercombe. Not as a reward for your service, not as a rescue from your station, but as a partnership, as my equal. I need your strength and your honesty beside me. I choose this. I choose you. Plainly." Tears she had never shed in humiliation or fear now pricked at her eyes. They were tears of a startling, overwhelming joy. She looked down at this powerful man kneeling before her, offering her not a fantasy, but a reality built on respect and truth. He was not rescuing a damsel. He was choosing a partner. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Then, louder, clearer, finding the simple, declarative tone that was the language of their bond. "Yes, Gideon. Plainly." 1 year later. Deep winter had once again fallen upon the lands of Withercombe, but inside the great house all was light and warmth.
Fires crackled in every hearth, their flames reflecting off polished wood and gleaming brass. The scent of beeswax and pine hung in the air, mingling with the faint, delicious aroma of baking gingerbread. The ghosts had been banished, replaced by the sounds of life. The cheerful chatter of servants, the ticking of the great hall clock, the distant, happy laughter of a child. Prudence Severn, no longer a poor relation, but the mistress of the house, stood in the north wing kitchen. It was still her sanctuary, but it was no longer a place of solitary work. Gideon stood beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration, as he clumsily tried to pour hot, spiced plum preserve into a glass jar. He spilled a little on the table. "You are a master of estate finance, my dear husband," Prudence said, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "But a menace with a ladle." He looked at her, his stern face softened by a love that had settled deep into his bones.
"It is a skill I am determined to acquire," he said, leaning down to kiss her. "It seems important." The door opened and Gideon's sister, Cordelia, came in, her face bright. "He's asking for you," she said, her voice full of affection. In the past year, she had blossomed from a timid girl under Mrs. Crane's thumb into a confident young woman, devoted to her new sister-in-law. From the adjoining room, which had been converted into a warm and sunny nursery, came a small, insistent cry. Prudence wiped her hands on her apron and went to her son, a robust baby with his father's dark eyes and, she hoped, her own steady nature. Mrs. Ingram entered with a tray of tea, her expression, once perpetually sour, now one of fierce, protective loyalty. She surveyed the messy table. "Leave that, madam," she said to Prudence. "The master can make his own mess. He can learn to clean it." Gideon chuckled, a sound that was now common in the halls of Withercombe. He successfully sealed a jar, holding it up to the light. The plums shone like dark jewels, suspended in syrup. It was the same preserve that had, in a way, started everything. A simple, honest thing that had pierced through his grief and shown him a path back to life. Later that evening, after the baby was asleep and the house was quiet, Gideon and Prudence sat together in his study. The estate ledgers lay open on the desk, their columns neat and their accounts balanced. Withercombe was solvent, its future secure. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, clean white. Gideon reached across the desk and took his wife's hand, the one with the faint, faded ink stain on the finger. "Are you happy, Prudence?" he asked quietly. She looked around the warm, safe room, at the man who was her partner in all things. She thought of the cold, abandoned kitchen she had been given as an insult, and how it had become the heart of her home, the foundation of her family. She thought of the journey from invisibility to being truly seen, from enduring to choosing. "I am," she said, her voice full of a calm, deep contentment. "I am home." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her ink-stained finger, a gesture of profound reverence. Together, they watched the snow fall, two quiet, resilient souls who had weathered their own long winter and found, at last, the warmth of their own hearth. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.